Well, we had a couple of weeks off. It's good to be back. We've been studying in Hebrews 11 for quite a long time, but it's been a good study. I hope that you all are enjoying it. We're going to bring it to an end in a couple of weeks, but so far we've looked at Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. And last time we looked at Moses. So just in a review, Moses was remarkable in many ways. Specifically, Moses was chosen by God before he was ever born. Well, that's not really anything unique because we were all chosen by God before we were born. Isn't that incredible? The God of the universe, the God who just spoke and the stars happened. And scientists now can't even figure out, there's so much they can't figure out about the stars and the galaxies and so forth. They get telescopes that go farther and farther out, and you know what they see? More and more galaxies of stars. Yeah. And God just spoke and made it happen. And by God's power, they stay where they are. And that same God chose us before we were ever born. You know, I love the stories about how kids will line up and they're going to play a ball game, and one kid's going to be the captain, the other one's going to be the captain, and they get to choose the kids, and they always choose the best kids first, and then the ones that are not so good, they get chosen last. That's not what God did. God chose us. Wow.
Anyway, in spite of us.
Right.
In spite of us.
Despite, yeah.
So even though Moses was raised in the Egyptian court, remember we talked about how he abandoned the luxury of the court to follow God and go with his people, the people of Israel. But when Moses was specifically called by God at the burning bush, he was very reluctant and argued with God. You got to go back and read that sometime. It's an interesting read. He kept saying no to God. He said no to God 3 or 4 times. I think it was 4 times. And God had to get rather stern with him.
Yeah, who made your mouth?
But he did obey in the end. But that's his humble beginning, where he came to in his life. He drew closer to God than anyone else in recorded history. He spent months directly in God's presence. 40 days the first time, without eating or drinking, talking to God. And then 40 more days the second time. And not to mention all the other times that he spent with God. God was the only one present when Moses died. And in fact, God himself buried Moses. There's nobody else in the world that can say that God buried him.
No.
But Moses can. That's amazing. So today we're going to continue the chronological journey through the history of faithful men and women and talk about Joshua and Rahab from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 30 and 31. Now, verse 30 talks about the fall of Jericho. It doesn't mention Joshua, but you can't talk about the fall of Joshua without Jericho without talking about Joshua, because it was Joshua's faith that led Israel to defeat Jericho. Well, actually, Israel didn't defeat it; God defeated it. And so we're going to talk about Joshua and Rahab tonight, and that's found. We're going to start in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 30 and 31. Just a couple of sentences. Someone will read that.
By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe when she had received the spies with peace.
Yes. Okay. Doesn't say much about him, does it? Well, we're going to go back in the Old Testament and read a little bit more about him and talk some more about him, because in order to understand what they did to be included in God's Hall of Fame in Hebrews chapter 11, we gotta go back to the Old Testament. So that's where we're going. let's do a little bit of review about Joshua. So Joshua was 40 years younger than Moses. When Moses died, Moses was 120 years old and Joshua was 80 years old. So when Moses fled Egypt after he killed the Egyptian and somebody else saw him and complained about it, threatened to turn him in, when he left, he was 40 years old. So it means that Joshua would have been an infant. And so when Moses came back to lead Israel out of Egypt, Joshua was now 40 years old. And Moses was 80 years old. And so when Moses led Israel out of Egypt, Joshua became his assistant. And when Moses went up to speak on the mountain with God for 40 days, Joshua went most of the way with him. We know that from Exodus 24:13. Does somebody want to read that? Exodus 24:13.
So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua and Moses and went up onto the mountain of God.
So when Moses went up on the mountain of God, Joshua went with him. Now, did he go all the way? Was he there while God was talking to Moses? We don't know. We simply just don't know. He was close by and he never went back down. We know that from Exodus 32:17. Exodus 32:17 says, when Joshua heard this noise of the people as they shouted, because they were worshiping the golden calf, he said to Moses, there's a noise of war in the camp. So this was before Moses. It was after God warned Moses that the people were sinning and sent them back down to the camp. And Joshua said he heard the people, and Moses, he said he thought there was war in the camp. And Moses, if you read the next verse, Moses says, sounds like singing to me. And so Joshua was up there. We don't know how much he interacted when God was speaking to Moses, but he was nearby, and he did see God's power directly. So Joshua was the logical choice for Moses' replacement. God picked him specifically to replace Moses. Moses went to God and said, God had told Moses, you're not going to the promised land. You screwed up. You're just not going in. Don't bring it up again. And Moses asked God, well, somebody needs to lead this people. And God says, bring me Joshua. So in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 7 and 8, it says, then Moses summoned Joshua and said to him in the sight of all Israel, be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord has sworn to their fathers to give to them, and you shall put them in possession of it. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. And then in verses 14 and 15, I'm not going to read it, God told Moses to bring Joshua to the tent of meeting, and there God commissioned Joshua to replace Moses. So Joshua was really very special. Remember that when Moses sent out the spies into the land, how many people brought back a good report?
Two.
Two. Who were they?
Joshua and Caleb.
That's right, Joshua and Caleb. It was Joshua and Caleb. Joshua was one of those spies. And after Moses died, Joshua led the people across the Jordan to a point near Jericho. But before they crossed the Jordan, Joshua sent 2 men to spy out the land, especially Jericho. And that's found in Joshua chapter 2. We don't have time to read it. I would encourage you to read it. It's a good read. It's easy read. We'll talk more about those spies when we talk about Rahab in a few minutes. Joshua led Israel across the Jordan River. And this in itself was an amazing miracle. It was like when God parted the Red Sea. So, because at that time of year, the Jordan River was in flood stage. It would have been spread out all over. We just passed, in our travels, we passed several rivers, and many of them, because it's spring, were in flood stage, and they were eking out into the banks.
They were completely full and overflowing.
Full and overflowing. Full and overflowing. The Rock River in Quad Cities, near Davenport and Moline and so
It's between
forth.
Iowa and Illinois.
That river is
It's always
always full, but this time of year it's usually practically in people's backyards and in their basements. The rivers were very high, but at this time the Jordan River was overflowing, and it says that right there in the book of Joshua. It says it was overflowing, and God stopped the water from flowing a long ways away, and he dried the river base such that the people crossed on dry ground. You know, when a river's been flowing on there, it would take a long time for it to be dry ground.
Yeah.
But God did it like that.
And muddy, yeah.
God did it like that. We don't have time to talk about all the amazing things about the crossing of the Jordan. It was a beautiful miracle. And you know what it did? It cemented Joshua as the leader of the people because they trusted him, because he was connected to God. God had done it, and Joshua told him what to do.
Yeah, he's the one that said, step out in the water, guys.
Yeah.
And the water stopped.
As soon as the priests with the ark put their feet in the water stopped a long ways away. But they had a lot of people to cross, because when they left Egypt, it was somewhere around 1.5 million to 2 million people. They still had that many people. That's a lot of people.
Plus cows and animals and trailers and
Yes.
Everything they owned, yeah.
It's faith, but it's obedience too.
Oh, yes.
You stepped out in obedience, you know.
That's right. And then God honored their obedience, which came from faith, and did the miracle. So let's talk about the conquest of Jericho. I love this part. The story starts in Joshua chapter 5, 13 to 15. And I love this part of the story. And so I'm going to let somebody else read. It's kind of, it's about 3 verses. Joshua chapter 5, verse 13 to 15.
And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" So he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandals off your feet. Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so.
Isn't that, the commander of God's army met Joshua. Who was this?
Jesus.
It was Jesus.
Jesus.
It was Jesus, because
Couple reasons.
there's a couple of reasons. But first of all, he said, the place where you're standing is holy ground. That only happens when God is there. What happened when at the burning bush? The same thing happened. Moses went to the burning bush and God said, "Stop, take off the sandals off your feet, for the place you're standing is holy ground." God was speaking to him. Here it was God speaking to him in the person of Jesus Christ. Wow.
And he accepted worship.
Yes, and he accepted his worship. An angel won't accept your worship, but God will. What an encouragement for Joshua. Can you imagine? He needed encouragement. Apparently he needed encouragement. And God himself came and encouraged. Physically, right where they could see it.
Well, and it's like, you for us or against us? No, I'm the friend of the Lord, army of the Lord. Oops. Boy, did I get that one wrong.
Yeah. So
He didn't come to take one side or the other. He came to take control. He was going to take over. It was his battle.
it was his battle. That's right. It was his battle. God fought him. Israel just played cleanup.
Pretty much.
Because in Joshua chapter 6, verses 1-5, and we're not going to read it, it records that what the commander of the Lord's army, Jesus, told Joshua to do it to defeat Jericho. What a crazy thing to do. They were to march around Jericho once a day for 6 days. Then on the 7th day, they were to march around Jericho 7 times. On the 7th time around, the trumpets would blow and the people would shout and the walls would fall. That's pretty crazy.
It's not something you think of yourself.
No. So Jericho was a very fortified city. It couldn't have been real large if you could march around it 7 times in one day. However, I think it was probably a typical size for a city such as that at the time. And we know the walls were thick because Rahab's house was literally built into the wall. So the walls were thick. Now, Bob, you were in Germany. Did you ever go to Rothenburg?
Oh, yeah.
See, Rothenburg is a existing walled city in Germany that you can still literally walk on the top of the wall all the way around the city.
It's an imperial city. It's an old
Medieval
imperial
city.
city.
And
It's never been destroyed.
and there are houses and all kinds of stuff built right into the wall there.
We took a picture. It's on a slide somewhere. You can see the wall. It's a fascinating place because you go through the gates and it still has portcullises that can come down. It just looks like it looks like Sleeping Beauty's castle, except it's original. But you walk the wall and you can see there's a place that had like a little tower that comes up and it has lace curtains in the window because somebody lives in it. You know.
Pretty amazing. So anyway, Joshua and Israel demonstrated their faith by doing exactly what God told them to do, no matter how ridiculous it sounded. And God did what he said he would do. The walls came down, but not where Rahab's house was. And we'll talk about Rahab in a minute. So why do you think God defeated Jericho in this way?
Well, it's obvious that wasn't them.
Yeah, I think he was testing Joshua and Israel to see if they would obey him. And also God demonstrated his power once again to show Israel, to show them that they had nothing to fear about the people they were going to fight in the promised land. Remember, it was their parents were the ones who were terrified of the people who lived in the promised land, and they had to die in the desert.
Yeah, their big fear was they're going to kill us and all of our children.
Yeah.
And only the children got to go in.
Yes. And God was showing them, those guys your parents were wrong. They were wrong. I've got this. I've got your back. We're doing this. I love the story. I love the story. God is so powerful. There's nothing that's too hard for God. And he does things in ways that we would never, ever expect often. So let's talk about Rahab. So
His ways aren't our ways.
No.
Who would have ever thought born of a virgin, things like that,
But Joshua proved his faith by his obedience to God's commands. He proved his faith by his obedience to God's commands. So let's get back to Rahab now. So in Hebrews 11 only mentions 2 women, Sarah and Rahab. We might consider Sarah was kind of like a believer
As much as she could be.
as much as she could be with Abraham. Rahab was a pagan. Yet both were commended for their faith. So let's start by talking about what we know about Rahab's background. We don't know very much, so it won't be very much, but we do know a few things. First of all, we know that Rahab lived in Jericho. Okay, there's an obvious thing. We know that she was a young woman. We know that she was a prostitute. It says several times that she was a prostitute. She was not married. From a modern perspective, Rahab was about as low as any woman could be, really. From our perspective, I would say. We know that Rahab had a house in the city wall, no doubt it was her family home with her parents and maybe even other siblings. We know Rahab also used her house as an inn. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we also know that Rahab recognized God as being the God of gods. And she recognized that God was all powerful and that he was going to use Israel to destroy the inhabitants of Canaan. She believed that God was powerful and she wanted to be on God's side.
They'd been listening. They knew about the 40 years before. Everybody knew.
Yeah, they knew about the crossing of the Red Sea. They knew about all kinds of stuff, and they were terrified. So the story about Rahab and the spies is found in Joshua chapter 2, verses 1 to 21. And again, I'm not going to read it for the sake of time because I'm already running out of time. It's a good story to read. It's very interesting. So Joshua's spies entered Jericho, and I'm sure they're going all over trying to figure out what's going on. And they came to Rahab's house and they entered there. And I believe that Rahab's house was like an inn, a place for that people would stay, spend the night or whatever. And even though Rahab was a prostitute, there's no indication that anything sexual between Rahab and the spies happened. I believe that she just ran a place where they could stay, and she provided meals and sleeping quarters.
So she married one of them.
Now, while they were there, Jericho's king learned that there were spies in town, and they sent a search party to look for them. But Rahab protected them. Now, she protected them by lying to the king's messengers and told them they'd already left. This is another instance where God used a sinful act to turn it into something that brought him glory. And that's what he did. God didn't receive any glory from Rahab's lie, but he received glory by everything else that transpired with Rahab. So Rahab hid the spies on the roof, the top of the city wall until it was late at night, and then she made them promise to save her and her family when they took the city. So how did Rahab demonstrate faith? First of all, Rahab, along with all the inhabitants of Jericho, had heard about what God had done. And she mentions it. If you read the story there in Joshua chapter 2, you'll hear this. This is what she talked about. She said that we'd heard about how they crossed how God had opened the Red Sea and Israel had crossed and then closed it on the Egyptian army. They'd heard all those stories. They'd heard how God had helped Israel defeat the kings on the east side of the Jordan River. And she knew that God was going to help them defeat Jericho. She knew it. And Rahab didn't know very much about God yet. She didn't, but she saw his power displayed for Israel and was afraid. And she wanted to be on God's side. And she was willing to betray her city to be saved. Interestingly, think about it. Rahab turned away from all the gods of the people of Jericho to hold on to the one true God who demonstrated his power to Israel. This would have been a huge cultural thing. Think about it. Their worship was completely ingrained in their culture. They had special celebrations like and holidays and family traditions. Can you imagine giving up Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, 4th of July, all kinds of other things to follow something else besides God? That's a big change. That's hard. But by doing that, truly Rahab demonstrated faith in God. And she acted on her faith repeatedly. First, in the clumsy way, she sent away the king's men onto their wild goose chase. And second, she hid the spies and helped them get away. And third, she made them promise to spare her and her family when she knew God was going to defeat Jericho. When God gave them the city, she said, "You promise you'll spare me." And she believed that it was going to happen by marking her house with the scarlet cord. Her faith in God's power never wavered. I see Rahab as just a powerful woman of faith, even though we know very little about it. So what became of Rahab? Joshua 6:25 says that Rahab lived in Israel from then on, and Israel was a place to be if you trusted God. So she lived in Israel from then on. And then Rahab is mentioned in Hebrews 11:31 as a woman of faith. And James also mentions Rahab. In James chapter 2, verse 25, it says, "And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way?" James, through the power of the Holy Spirit, said that Rahab demonstrated her faith by what she did. Remember, faith and obedience go together. Obedience is what faith looks like. And she did what was right, and that proves her faith. But Rahab's biggest honor is the fact that she became a mother in the line of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ could track his DNA back to Rahab. Matthew chapter 1, verse 5 says that Rahab married Salmon and became the mother of Boaz. And who was Boaz?
Ruth's husband.
That's right. So Boaz was born to Rahab, and then Boaz married another pagan woman, Ruth. And so both Boaz and both Rahab and Ruth are physically in the line of Jesus Christ. Isn't that amazing? Jesus truly came for all men and women, both Jew and Gentile. And we are all represented.
And maybe why
Mary.
Boaz was more kindly to Ruth, because his mother was an immigrant.
Yes, a Gentile.
She was a Gentile.
Rahab put her trust in God, and God blessed her beyond measure. God will accept anyone who puts his or her faith in him. What did Peter say? I can't even remember. Anyway, so I just find this whole thing about Rahab, it's just a little bitty story. But the writer of Hebrews mentions Rahab in the hall of faith. And I just think that that's beautiful. Here's a woman who saw the power of God and wanted on God's side and just believed that God would take care of her. And he did. So much so that she became Jesus' great something grandmother. So I just think that that's a beautiful thing. Anybody have any comments or questions or anything about Joshua or Rahab? I know I went pretty quick.
Well, or study Hebrews, not Genesis. Right.
But
Now, in your research, Gary, was there ever anything written how far away the encampment was to Jericho, or were they right there at Jericho?
nothing that I could see.
I think Jericho is a plain. So they would have crossed the river and probably been right there, probably within view of it.
The people from Jericho probably could see them. It had to be a big camp.
Yeah. A lot of fires going on at night too.
Well, you think about it, with more than 1 million people, that's a big camp.
And probably way bigger than the city,
Way, way bigger than the city. Yeah,
which is why they were so afraid.
that's part of the reason, yeah. But yeah, it's an interesting story. Okay, next week we will, if you read the next verse, verse 32 and chapter 11, it mentions several people. We're going to go through those very quickly, and then we're going to do 4 or 5 people next week, and then we'll spend another time with Samuel and David, and then we're going to wrap up Hebrews 11. So that's where we're going with it, our study. I'm going to stop the recording.